Indecisive King and the King, the Crown, and the Widow. Once upon a time, there was a very wise king. Every morning he opened the gates of his castle to the people of his kingdom and held an open court where the people could ask for advice, make formal complaints, or petition for his help. The only requirement for seeking an audience with the king was that afterward you had to do whatever he directed. "My neighbor's tree fell on my fence and broke it," one man reported. "Half of the tree is lying on my property. Who should pay and remove it and repair my fence?" "That's an easy one," the king said. "The half of the tree that lies on your property now belongs to you. You will cut up the tree together, and both of you will use the wood to rebuild your fence. Sell the remaining wood and split the profits evenly." "Sounds fair," said the man. "Thank you, your grace." "I'm not finished," said the king. "Use your portion of the sales to purchase a new tree and plant it with your neighbor, in place of the one they lost." The man sighed, but the king was very wise. On another day, a sad woman in tattered clothes approached the king. "Your grace," she said, "creatures of Grimm destroyed my village. My family is dead. Everything I've ever cared about is gone." "I'm very sorry for your loss." The king stepped down from his throne and clasped the hands of the forlorn widow. "What is your question?" he asked softly. "What should I do now?" He studied her face for a long while. He smiled sadly. "You must keep living." The widow had no choice but to listen to his advice. And the king was not only wise, but generous. "Please stay in the castle and take what time you need to grieve," said the king. "When you're ready to come to me and ask your question again." An attendant led the widow to her quarters, gave her new clothes and a warm meal, and left her alone. For many weeks the widow did nothing but sleep, eat, and cry. But eventually she took new interest in the life of the court, and particularly in the kindly king. For the next 6 months, she rose each morning and went to his court to watch him dole out advice and justice. The widow admired his steady gentleness and perception. He always saw the truth of a situation, and he listened not only to the people's words, but also to their hearts. It happened that the king's grateful subjects sometimes brought him offerings, from food they had prepared to livestock or precious jewels and gold. The king, ever humble, always encouraged others to give to those truly in need, but he was also gracious and polite. It didn't hurt to accept their gifts and then donate them to a good cause himself. One day, a man with wild eyes arrived with a burlap sack that held a gift for the king. When it was his turn to speak, he pulled a silver crown from the sack. "Please take this, my grace," the man said. "Thank you, but I already have a crown," the king replied. "Not like this one. Believe me, you will be doing me a favor by taking it. It does me no good. And as the wisest king in the land, you are the only one suited to wear it." The king demurred. "You flatter me," he said. The man insisted. "Allow me to come closer, and I'll explain." Finally, the king gestured the man forward, as the guards watched anxiously. The man leaned in and whispered in the king's ear. The king raised an eyebrow. "How came you to have this?" the king asked. "That doesn't matter. Will you accept?" "Very well. It's a hard offer to refuse, and you have made me curious." The king allowed the man to place the crown on his head. It fit him perfectly, and he closed his eyes. A moment later, the king snatched the crown from his head and leapt from his seat. His face was pale as the moon. "What is this?" he cried. "Guards, seize that man!" But the man had disappeared. "Find him!" the king spluttered. He collapsed back into the throne and turned the crown over and over in his hands. "It can't be true," he muttered. Then he placed the crown back on his head and stared off in the distance. "Your Grace," an attendant asked, "there are still dozens of supplicants seeking audience." The king would not respond, and the attendants dismissed them along with the entire court. "Sorry," they said. "It's best to come back tomorrow." As they were led out of the chamber, the widow glanced back at the king on the throne. His brow was furrowed in concentration. The next morning, the king wandered into court late. For the first time that anyone could remember, dark smudges under his bleary eyes suggested he had not slept, though the crown was nowhere to be seen. The king was distracted, and behaving oddly as he entertained questions from the court. "Your Grace," a man said, "my daughter wants to marry her childhood best friend, but he is the son of bakers. I had hoped she would marry higher than her station. What should I do?" The king shifted in his seat. "Are the boy's parents good bakers?" The man frowned. "I suppose so, yes." "Then what more can you ask for? Let your daughter be happy and enjoy free bread." "I hadn't thought of that. Thank you, Your Grace." A moment later, the king waved the man back. "Wait a moment. Perhaps I was wrong. A family requires more than bread. You should follow your instincts and wait for a better match for your daughter." "What?" the widow said. She clapped her hands over her mouth, but she wasn't the only one who was surprised. "All right, if you're sure." The man looked around the court in confusion. "Of course I'm sure. I'm your king!" The king clapped. "Next!" The court murmured. "What's wrong?" the widow asked the servant. "He's never changed his mind before." "Or given bad advice," the servant added. "So you agree that was bad advice?" the widow asked eagerly. Suddenly nervous, the servant muttered, "Of course not! He's the king!" and hurried away. The king continued to second-guess himself, his advice increasingly erratic, until he jumped up and rushed out of the chamber without even dismissing the court. The next day was much the same, as was the next. A red crease marked the king's forehead, and he became ever more sullen and preoccupied. Then one morning, the court was closed altogether. "What's going on?" the widow asked. "The king is no longer accepting audiences with his subjects," an attendant answered. "Is he all right?" the widow asked with concern. "He is the king," an attendant said. The widow threw up her hands in exasperation. "What kind of answer is that?" Soon the king's court announced that he was seeking wisest philosophers in the land to consult with him. The person who helped him would receive their heart's desire. Would-be advisors flocked to the castle for a chance to give the king advice for a change. The only rule was that if they breathed a word about his dilemma, they would be executed. That doesn't sound like the king, the widow said. He is a good man. People change, the king's steward said. This all started with that crown, the widow said. Where is it? Locked away in the bowels of the castle. He has the only key to the room, the steward said. The king spends most of his time there. It's the first place he goes after speaking to his advisors. The steward sniffed. He never even talks to me anymore. What could make him so strange and paranoid? The widow asked the question. Had been plaguing her. Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you, the steward said, on threat of death. The widow wandered to the lower levels of the castle until she found the one door that was locked. She listened at the door, but no one was inside. She peered through the keyhole until she spied a wooden chair with a crown upon it. That's no throne for a king, she murmured. She hid in an empty room across from it and waited. She did not have to wait long. The king had an audience with an advisor that morning, and he soon came hurrying down to the room, looked around suspiciously before drawing a key and opening a door. He closed it tightly behind him. The widow crept up to the door and peered through the keyhole. The king sat on the wooden chair, the crown on his head. His head was bowed, as though the crown had grown too heavy for him to lift. He murmured to himself, then suddenly pulled the crown from his head and threw it across the room. He hurried over to pick it up and then placed it back on the chair with care. The widow took a deep breath. She stood and knocked on the door. The door flew open. The king's face contorted with rage. He seized her arm. Who are you? What are you doing here? He called out the hallway. Guards! The widow raised a hand protectively. Your Grace, half a year ago I came to you with a question. I don't remember. She swallowed her disappointment. You told me to come back when I was ready to ask my question. I don't give out advice anymore, the king said, sighing. I can barely help myself. The widow's voice was firm. I'm not here to ask for your wisdom, but to offer some of my own. You called for people to come and advise you on your problem. I am here to make my attempt. You, he shook his head, but she persisted. Tell me what's troubling you. Whatever it is too much for one person to bear, and we need our king back. The king considered, then nodded. This crown has shown me a vision of a crossroads in my future. I will have an important decision to make one day, and from what I can tell, an impossible one. I can't see my way to a favorable outcome. This has never happened to me before. Not all outcomes are favorable, my grace, the widow said. I can't accept that! This crown has given me time to figure it out, to work out a solution. This crown has burdened you with a problem that you are not yet able to handle. That perhaps you will never be able to handle. In the meantime, it has paralyzed you with indecision. Even if you come up with an answer, you will have more time to wonder if it's the correct one, if such a thing exists. The king frowned. If you can't make a simple decision now, whether a girl should marry a baker, or if two people claiming ownership over the same pig should divide it into two, then how will you respond when the moment of the decision finally comes? If it ever comes. The widow picked up the crown. This is no gift. It is a curse. What should I do? The king asked. The widow smiled. You must keep living. The king collapsed into the rockety old seat. That's good advice, he sighed. You gave me that advice, but you also gave me more than that. You gave me my life, hope for a future, and soon afterward, her face flushed. A reason for living. She held up the crown. May I? He held up a hand. You don't want to do that. You'll forgive me if I just ignore your excellent wisdom this once. She placed the crown on her head. The widow saw a future, a moment, a decision posed by the man before her, only he seemed different than he did now, happier, and he did look different, at her differently than he did now. He asked her a question. She didn't need any time to consider her answer. Yes, she breathed. Yes, what? The king asked when she removed the crown. Let's wait and discover that question together, she said. I imagine my vision was rather different from yours. Excuse me? The king asked. Forget it. She placed the crown on the ground and resisted the urge to stomp on it. If you want my honest advice, I would lock this crown in here and throw away the key. Put it out of your mind. Live your life and trust it in yourself to make the right decision when the moment comes. With all the information you have at hand, she shrugged. Or allow yourself to make the wrong decision, comforted in the knowledge that you tried your very best. In either case, the future is one of your own making. The king smiled. Allow myself to make a mistake. She took his hand and pulled him to his feet. Just as you gave me permission to go on living, even when my life had changed forever. I think I do remember you, he said again. Good, she said. It was a start. Once upon a time, there was a very wise king and an even wiser queen.